Okay, thank you, Richard, and thank you for joining me here. It's a rather nice sunny day here in the UK, and I'm joining you from home. Actually, I'm working at home today, so hopefully the internet connection will hold off, and Richard will be in support otherwise. Can I just check with you, Richard, in terms of looking at national plans and control of the screen? Will you have that for this session?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that if that helps. I've got in front of me um, a folder with a selection of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, about 15 different country national plans. And in some cases, within the folders, they have specific plans. Like I mentioned a moment ago, BVI has a National Maritime Search and Rescue Plan. So I can share all of those after the session. And also, if you wanted me to pull up the Nigeria plan, I could do that. Although it's a huge document, I can do that. You saw that?
The aim of this session, folks, is basically to, as part of the assignment, as you know, we've looked at principles and we've looked at step-to-step approaches. So we've had a good discussion in these refresher intellectual sessions at the principles and implementation side of plans in theory, at least according to Alexander. And we've critiqued that a little bit. So in a sense, we've got effectively a kind of academic or informed idea of practice. But of course, the proof, as they say in English, is always in the pudding. And what we mean by that is essentially we need to have a look at the practice itself, and really whether the things are attached, detached, or simply just not talking to each other. So as part of this session, on Brightspace, we asked you to sort of, there's a folder on Brightspace which has a number of emergency plans and policies there for you to look at. And the hope was that you could have a look at those. If you haven't been able to do that for whatever reason, then please do. And the idea of this is for us to really have a way of understanding how we might use examples of plans in our assignments and in our essays. In other words, how we can use the professional practice. Now, of course, for you talented students working in Oman, you can, of course, use your own sector and institutional plans if you have access to them, and if you want them also to be used to some extent in the public domain. But I also appreciate that, and we also appreciate teaching on these kind of courses, is that may simply not be possible for whatever reason, either access or willingness, or in some instances really just strategic use. So the idea is, can we use publicly accessible emergency plans in our essays to illustrate what is good and what is bad? And Richard and myself were talking earlier, and probably a good place to start before we look at the plans, of course, is really for us to outline what we think a good plan should have in it. In other words, if we were to say, as we've looked at before, we expect emergency plans to do a number of things. They have a number of principles and they have a number of implementation elements to them and so forth. And we've been through Alexander's book, and he talked about having an emergency operations center, having instant command, instant media centers, and of course, clear understanding and ideas of stakeholders, the identification of stakeholders and institutions. So we've talked about that a little. So what I'd like to do now in the next 5-10 minutes really is for us to have a kind of group discussion about what we think a good emergency plan should include, and in practice where one would start when looking at trying to set out what an emergency plan should have in it. So I'll start the ball rolling, because one of the things that you'll often find when we look at emergency plans is they often include statements about vision, about aims, about objectives, and increasingly they have a mission statement. And if you look at the documents that you have available on Brightspace, you'll see automatically that some of the documents have the same kind of style, the same kind of structures, in that they include a vision of what an emergency plan is supposed to have. They include a mission statement. They may often include, and most importantly, aims and objectives. And if you remember back to what Richard was talking about in previous discussions, how this is where you should outline where your strategic objectives would be. So let me start by saying at the beginning, usually the idea of the plan and the parameters of the plan are set out in many ways how ambitious it is, what it might include, how large it will be related to the aims and ambitions and objectives that it has. So that's the first place to start. But what else do you think, group, an emergency plan should have? In other words, if we could treat what a good plan should have, what kind of elements would you want to see it include? Ladies and gentlemen, the floor is yours. Over to you. Can I just ask somebody if they'd like to chip in? Who'd like to start?
I'll go ahead, no problem.
Thank you, Sawa.
Most welcome. So for me, an emergency plan, it depends on the country that we're at and what is the purpose of this emergency plan. And who are we aiming to be involved in this emergency plan, and who will be at the end of the day, conducting the exercises and so on. So first of all, we have to have a clear understanding of what we need to include in it. And once we've included the material-wise, we need to have a clear language. Our communication channels are very important. And I would go for our resources that are very important.
For that, Wahid, what do you think from your airline sector? What does a good emergency plan include in its initial parts from your experience in the airline industry then?
Good afternoon, everybody. Actually, you surprised me with that question. I just woke up.
Sorry about that, Wahid.
It's fine. The emergency plan. The most important to have, actually, the policy is very important. What is the emergency plan at first? Number one. Number two, we have to have an organization, a structure of the emergency plan. Let us say who is responsible, who's going to be the head of the emergency or the lead of the emergency, and who are the entity who are going to respond during the emergency. They have to identify heads for each sector who are going to respond. At the same time, they have to identify their own roles, the resources for each entity. Number one. Number two, they have to identify their own resources. They have to identify the resources for each sector, the duty which each sector actually they are going to respond. At the same time, the resources, the function for each entity or each sector, they're going to respond. At the same time, the budget. At the same time, the communication between them. At the same time, the cooperation with the other entity outside, because we have a link with the other organization outside from the airline. For example, the Minister of Health, the airport, the fire brigade, the national plan as well. In airline, actually, we have control center. We have actually the operation, and we have the technical, and we have the strategic. We have to identify the hierarchy between them and how the information actually it should be reported from the operation to the technical to the strategic level. This is all should be actually included in the plan, and the information to be.
So quite a lot.
Sorry.
So quite a lot of things there should be included in the emergency plan, and I'd like to take you back, really, to the first part. And you made a very important point right at the start, and you talked about policies. And I think Salwa also mentioned policies as well, although I may be wrong there. And actually, when we look at the examples that we have, one of the first parts of any emergency plan does is to locate it for the reader, or actually for the participants, within the overall framework of disaster management in that country, or within that sector, or within that institution. So what I'm trying to say to you there is, often, as you quite rightly say, the emergency plan, well, we're not operating in a vacuum. It's not a single document with everything in. Often it's related to other parts of the disaster management system. It may be the central part of how we have elements of it that are critically important. But the danger with all disaster managers is that they only know the emergency plan, if at all, and don't necessarily understand the wider system. So you'll see in your list of documents, and we'll go to one of them in a moment, that some of them talk about a national management policy, and some of them talk about a national management plan. And of course, there are different terminologies depending on where we are in different countries. But what we're really talking about is the relationship between the framework. So in your area, Wahid, when you talk about working in developing an emergency plan for, say, an airline, then that also, in the initial part, will nearly always include or may include a discussion about which parts of the legislative framework of the country, which parts of the legislative framework of the industry are most influential in setting this out. And so I wanted just to make that point, because that becomes very important for when we're going to look at plans, particularly we'll have a look at the Indian case, where they spend a lot of time talking about how the national plan is located, not just within their country, but also in relation to, say, the UN Sendai agreements, the framework. And therefore that's quite important. So the principles of the plan may actually be shaped not just by what people want within the plan, but also by the legislative framework that they have to operate. So to illustrate what Salwa was talking about, that may be whether your resources are possible and what resources are not. So that's an important point for us to consider firstly, and I don't want us to lose that in the discussion that we're about to take. Can I ask Mohammed Al-Tamimi, what do you think an emergency plan should also include in relation to what Salwa and Wahid were talking about?
Hello, everyone. I guess the emergency plan should be produced by people who has authority to implement it. I mean, as you said, there has to be a policy or a framework for the country, so everyone can work upon that framework and produce his plan. And the plan, I mean, producing it alone won't be enough without implementing it, and implementing it won't be enough without having, let's say, enough power to do that. Also, as Wahid and Salwa said, you need basically to assess your resources, whether you have enough resources or whether you need more resources to make your plan. Means of communication, the incident command system, I mean, what system is going to be used to make that plan work.
Very important point there, Mohammed, that basically what we would also expect an emergency plan often to include in practice is a kind of listing of who are the key institutions, who are the key players within the emergency plan itself. And often this can be one of the most important sections for us to think about, because there's always a danger within emergency plans that they become a kind of list of everybody who should be there in the room and what their institution is. But alongside any good emergency plan will also go some kind of organizational mapping as a way of understanding how these institutions fit together and who has hierarchy, and if we take Wahid's point, who leads, who element will be led by which particular part, and who will have overall responsibility may also be included in the plan itself. But you'll be surprised when you look at practical examples, and myself and Richard could, like yourself, could probably mention many plans that we've seen where what seems to be clear at who's in charge may not necessarily be clear to those people who are actually the stakeholders in it. And actually, some plans are not very clear about who's in charge. They have an idea that it's a kind of network of coordination. So identifying, who has leadership at particular points is, of course, very important in itself, and you make a very valuable point there. Mohammed made a very good and important point that within any emergency plan, you often need to identify who are the key institutions and who are the key stakeholders. And often you'll find in any emergency plan, there's a listing of who the major players are and what are the key institutions either created by the emergency plan or the emergency plan will involve. And that's absolutely critical. But alongside most good plans, there's also the need to make sure that those plans are accessible, that people understand that they're not just in it, but they must do something as well. And therefore, an organizational mapping is often also very important. In other words, it becomes clear to the reader and also to the participant how each institution fits into the disaster management plan, into the emergency plan, and also who leads at various points, who's responsible for particular roles, and who leads at various points. No doubt myself and Richard could mention many examples where we've read emergency plans where either it looks very clear who's responsible and who's leading in various roles, only to find out that nobody really understands it in practice, or more accurately, it can also be a case that it's not very clear in the emergency plan. So it's one of the things that you might want to look at, because what you'll often find with in an emergency plan is you get listings of institutions, but is that also complemented or backed up by a clear organizational map, a clear way of networking and understanding how these institutions fit together? It's a good litmus test for you to think about. So keep that in mind. So can I just move over to Muhammad Ali? Are there any additional factors that you would like to think? What other things might we want to consider in a good emergency plan?
Yes, actually, from my point of view, and from some of the plans which I have checked on maritime sectors, there are some plans mentioning what are the threats that might cause for this organization or for certain ports or area, plus the plan for this area. What does this plan is covering for? I mean, the certain area which the plan is made for. Also, beside the threats, who are the participants and what is the initial response? And plus, of course, if this event or this disaster comes beyond the capability of this organization, who is participating from outside? How these people coming from outside could help or give the support for solving this disaster or acting or responding?
Yeah, I mean, you make a very good point, because often you'll also find in good emergency plans, you do find maps in some instances. And sometimes those maps are useful in that they outline what are the regions, because of course it may also be that you're trying in your emergency plan to identify the international, the role of the national, and the role of the regional, say operation centers, and how they fit together in a network and in an organizational map. So the regions that they cover and having clarity about what rules will follow in those regions becomes very important. I couldn't agree more. It doesn't mean that you should say that every good emergency plan has to have a map in it. Although I think Richard often says that the key to disaster management is often good mapping. So you may expect that to find that in an emergency plan as well. But I think your idea of also understanding the geographical basis of what an emergency plan is supposed to cover is quite important. And that, why I mentioned that also, to take Muhammad Ali's point even further, is that you want to make sure that your national emergency plan, which may have a different geographical mapping, also relates to your sector mapping. And that becomes very important for the way we think about things. So keep that in mind for when we're thinking about the way stakeholders and institutions fit together in practice. So with that part finished, is there anything else that people would like to add? Lubno, have you got anything you'd like to add into the discussion from your experiences? I mean, what do you think an emergency, if you look at an emergency plan, should it be large, for example? Do you think an emergency plan should be a very large and weighty document that includes everything? Or should it be a rather streamlined document? What's your preference or your idea what a good emergency plan might include?
I believe it should be simple, easy to follow, and to implement. It should be in a language that is common for all the participants to understand. And another point I'd like to know to mention that recognition of hazards has to be in the plan. and for all the stakeholders to understand what sort of hazards that might occur in their area. Another point I wanted to add is the mode of communication, whether it's vertical or horizontal, within the same organization or from an organization to another, and from lower, I mean, from the different levels, meaning bronze and gold and all. What is the mode of communication? And it should be all in common language that to be understood by all participants. Another point I wanted to add is for them to respect the disaster quantum, meaning what are they expected to do in the relief state, what are rehabilitation, reconstruction, mitigation. So this should be respected, that the plan should be divided into phases, so everybody would know what is expected from them during every phase. That's all.
Yeah, Lubia, I think you make some really good points there. I mean, in terms of the way we think about this, I mean, without doubt, to take your last point first, most plans also have an identification that are at different phases of the disaster management cycle, and that may require changes over of different roles and procedures and leadership functions within that. So I think you're perfectly right. And it also, in many ways, that's the common language about what we would expect an emergency plan to have. I think the interesting point, if I may add also, is that increasingly you will see, of course, agendas around disaster risk reduction, disaster risk reduction strategies. And increasingly you'll see quite a lot of that appearing in the emergency plan itself. In some countries, and if you look at the example of India, for example, on Brightspace, they spend quite a lot of time talking about the role of the emergency planning and the emergency plan when it comes to disaster risk reduction. Whereas traditionally, the focus had been, rightly or wrongly, is that you tended to find a large majority of the plan was actually, of course, on the response phase. So there's been a kind of evening out, if you like, of the parts of the disaster management plan. The danger is, of course, is that we've just created a list amongst our discussion about what a good plan should have. That means that if we include them all, we're going to end up with a 300-page document. And Lubna's point is absolutely critically important, that the plan has to be accessible. You know, what you don't want is in a severe situation is a plan that's incomprehensible to read and has huge contradictions in it. And one actually finds that the bigger the plans are, the danger is that you actually have the greater potential for contradictions. So we're always trying to build, if you like, a kind of coming up with a suboptimal solution. We can an emergency plan is in many ways a guide. For some, it's a very detailed guide, where you're trying to actually impose a hierarchy and clarity. So you have clear ideas about who takes decisions and everybody should follow the plan, as they would say. For others, the plan is much more of a guide. It's there to set out who should be in the room, who should have responsibility, but allows discretion for the players to adapt according to the hazards. And this brings me on to one final point before we look at plans, is that to take Lubna's point as well, there's also an identification in a plan usually of the idea of what are the most likely hazards that the emergency plan is supposed to deal with. So some emergency plans may be quite narrow. I would have thought for in Waheed, working in the airlines, for example, then there's a clear identification of what kind of disasters what kind of hazards there are that affect airports and airlines. So in a sense, the plans are dictated around those. Whereas, of course, for nations, they may be also clear vulnerabilities as to where they are geographically to natural hazards. So, for example, you know, in your own country, you know that cyclones are going to be a major issue, and therefore your plan will have a very strong focus on dealing with that hazard. But so in a sense, it also an emergency plan makes some choices. It positions the emergency response to also about how it deals with different hazards, how it develops some kind of risk register about what kind of hazards should include, and in addition to that, in many ways, also what kind of resources should follow. Salwa made the really important point right at the start that plans don't work if you don't have resources, and therefore you need to also identify where the resources are. So the resources should follow the plan, and there should be an expectation that when you're designing the plan, that you design it with realistic resources in mind. We've discussed this before. Okay, so thank you for that part. I'd like to move on now, as we've been going on for half an hour, to maybe look at a couple of examples of plans.
Lee,
And here I'm going to hand over to my learned colleague, Richard.
Oh, sorry. Hey, Lee, just before we move on, can I just make a couple of...
Yep. Are you happy with that, Richard? Anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, just couple of very simple points to add to it. First of all, and this is really basic, but actually so many plans don't do this. It is vital that the plan has a version number. In other words, when I pick up a plan, you give me a plan for whatever purpose the plan was written, I need to know which version of the plan I'm reading, because plans, as we know, are living documents. And you produce a version in January 2018, but then something happens and now there's a version dated April 2018. So version 1 already has become version 2, or version 1.15 has become version 1.16. And unless we're careful, what we'll find is there are all kinds of different versions of the plan spread around the place, and everyone's working on different versions. So as well as a version number, it's important to have a copy number. In other words, let's say you've produced the plan and you're giving it to 20 people, then you want to have a record as to who got copy number 1, who got copy number 2, and who got copy number 3. So there's version control. You know that the 20 people who now have your plan have the up-to-date version. All of them have the up-to-date version. So if you went into any one of their offices and said, show me the plan, they will show you version 2, not version 1.15. So a copy number and a version number is actually a really important point. And my other 2 points to make, Salwa absolutely rightly said that we need to make sure that the plan identifies the resources. Everything that is identified in terms of resources, equipment, personnel has to have been agreed by the participants who helped write the plan. So this is not something you sit in a room on your own with a shut door coming up with a plan. A plan is written in consultation with others, so that when it's agreed, when the plan is written and actually produced, somebody in the hospital or the police or the hotel or whoever is on the address list for the plan, when they read the bit that relates to them, they recognize instantly what it is that they're being asked to provide, because they offered it in the first place. They said, yes, I can provide that. So a plan should not come as a shock to you. It should be a confirmation of what you've agreed. And I suppose the very last thing I was going to say is that so often plans that we have read, that Lee and I have read, seem to have been written in a language to meet an international agenda rather than to meet the needs of the country. And I think particularly in terms of risk reduction, the UN ISDR requirement for every country to have a risk reduction plan, that's great. But actually what happens is that people end up writing the language they hope the UN will enjoy seeing rather than how they're going to do it. And Mohammed Al-Tamtami has just given a really good point in the notes there. He said that there should be something like a change log between the different versions. Absolutely right. This is a managed document. It's not just something that you keep producing different versions. It's a managed document. Thank you for that, Mohammed. Okay, I'll pass back to Professor Lee.
Yeah, and I'll just chip in, keep the discussion going, because this is great. I'm really enjoying this if nobody else is. Basically, of course, not only do you need to understand about the log change, but of course the other point is people need to be aware of what the plan is. So many times we are, and I think Richard's point is right, emergency plans are written by disaster management elites, of which many people doing this course are part of those elites in Oman and elsewhere, for other elites. So they're talking to other disaster managers, and they become part of a disaster management community. And what Richard is actually talking about also by bringing in Sendai is that they're now actually also looking above them to international elites as well. And there's always a danger there that in the pursuit of common terminology, i.e. having a common terminology that everybody understands, that one also creates a terminology that nobody outside disaster management actually understands. And one should always be careful that often disaster management elites, even in countries, but also in sectors, are a rather small group of people. And where you have major hazards, then you also have the danger of vulnerability that you lose or you're unable to actually activate many parts of those elites who've been part of the plan itself. So the idea also is also to make sure that everybody has access to the plan as well that needs to have those access. And it's not always the case. So many times we talk to actually disaster management planners who may not have even seen the most recent version, or who may not have even been part of the discussion group or the group that actually voted in the first place. And that's always a danger, because then you're actually trying to interpret somebody else's rules or what somebody else decided or what somebody else thought was appropriate, when you know in your sector it might not be the case. So that's just to reinforce that point. So is there anything else while we're together on that point that anybody would like to add before we actually hopefully have a look at a plan or so? Wahid, I can see you're flashing on or off. Would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I would like just to add, I believe during the policy it has to be, should be included the minimum standard of preparedness actually, or the minimum action, or the initial important action should be included actually in the policy. I think that's important. Number two, I think the training. The policy should including the training between the entities or the organization. They have to plan at least once a year or twice a year, which is actually some of the emergency plans not included. They don't see that.
Very good.
That's all.
Very good. Thank you very much. Richard? Richard, are you still there?
Yep, still here.
I'd like you, if it's possible, is it possible through Brightspace to just pop up the, I'd like you to pop up the Zambian management plan, if a management policy, if it's possible, on Brightspace. Could you do that from your end? Is that possible?
Yep.
It's actually in Brightspace.
Yeah, it is. So if we go to content, I think, and then you'll see Zambia as the top of the list. Zambia National Disaster Management Policy 2015. There it is.
Can you open that for me?
Okay, it's open. With any particular page?
Yeah, I'd like you just to run down keep running down. So most plan, this is a policy, okay? So just stop on the contents page for a moment there. One of the reasons why we've done this, people, is we've also provided a number of documents so you can see them, so you can actually, and many of you are actually practicing emergency planning, so you'll know the feel of your own document. But I made the point right at the start about there's a relationship between a policy and a plan, and this is a Zambian National Disaster Management Policy. So within that is a very strong focus, and you will also see as if we move down to the introductory section. Could you move it down slightly, or to the conceptual framework on page 1, Richard? Is that possible?
Yep,
Can you
sure.
do that for me?
Let's just go down.
So here we've got within the emergency plan, firstly, an introduction. And the introduction, within this policy, and I think the important point is, what I'm asking you to think about in your master's essay, and one of the things you may want to consider is, what is the relationship between a policy and the plan? And in many ways, do you need to define it in a good emergency plan? Now, from the perspective of this document about Zambia, which is actually outlining the National Disaster Management Policy, they actually go to great lengths to actually outline a conceptual framework to understand both the acts that need to be looked at and the key policy dynamics and policy aspects that might need to be included. So in a sense, part of their introduction here is that they've actually outlined a conceptual framework as to how the policy will inform a plan. And sometimes that's a good thing, sometimes that's a bad thing. But really what I'm getting you to think about, from a critical evaluation point, is that what you're really deciding is how wide or how large your plan should be. What it might cover is related to what kind of policy it's based to trying to deal with. So often we think about a plan as being addressing a particular hazard, and that's perfectly right, or a particular threat. It's about dealing with a particular problem that emerges as emergency planners. But often many emergency plans also start, and many policy documents also start with outlining the overall framework in which it's based. In other words, it's backward looking, looking at where it's been and where it's based, in other words, to forward look at the hazard that it might face in the future. Now, I'm not sure if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but what I'm trying to say is that what I would like you to think about in your assignments is that important? Is that important for when we think about emergency plan, when we're formulating an emergency plan? How wide do we want it to be? How much should it be policy based? And how much is it based upon addressing all hazards? Or is it all of it? So have a think about that in relation to that. And in the Zambian case with the policy, they've actually gone to actually quite big lengths as to why that may be. Can we move around a bit further in the document? Because what you'll also find in many of the documents is they talk also in the first sections about, as I talked about before, an evaluation of the disaster management system, setting out the vision, the mission statement, and the aims and objectives. Now here it will be setting out the aims and objectives of the policy. So you'll see here, thank you very much, there on page 4, you talked about here are the major frameworks that might need to be included within that. And then once that's done, this particular, so here on page 4, as Richard's got there, you'll see the formulation of the policy is based around all these particular policy domains. But the problem with all those policy domains is which are more important for Zambia and which is the most important for you in your sector when looking at what an emergency plan might include. Now, I'm not saying you should spend large amounts of words on this, but it's something that you might want to consider, the relationship between the policy and the plan, or the framework and the plan. Because if you go back to what Richard talked about in the course, then often when this is a way of also mapping the strategic objectives of the policy and the framework to the strategic objectives of the plan, and whether they conflict or not. If you remember the sessions that Richard did when he talked about conflicting objectives in a plan. And some of those objectives may simply be because of the fact that they are brought down from wider policy agendas, and therefore they are conflictory in their nature in the first part. Then a policy will also, as a plan, will also include some kind of situational awareness element to it. And you'll see in the Zambian plan, Richard, if we move to the next chapter, you'll see again a very strong discussion about setting out the situational awareness of the hazards. What are the vulnerabilities? And to what extent, how does this relate to the mapping of hazards? So what one in this part, this is where you're really talking about that within most emergency plans are nearly always some kind of sections which deal with the idea of risk assessment, risk analysis, and often about how a risk register might be formulated or exist. So whether that's good or bad, that's for something for you also to consider in your essay as well in relation to that. And if we move, so you'll see that the situation awareness, the definitions of the vulnerability of the disasters and so forth will become very important. And from that will then be the setting out of the objectives. If you look at page 3 about the objectives and then the building capacity. You'll see in chapter 3 of this Zambian National Disaster Policy, you'll see, for example, setting out the capacity. And there in that sections, you may see, for example, the idea about who are the institutions and who are the stakeholders. But if one takes page 10, just hold it there, Richard. We started out by talking about the guiding principles. And you'll see in the plan, you have a section which talks about the guiding principles. You have sections about the goal, sections about the objectives. And one of the things you need to think about really in terms of your assignments is what are these lists supposed to do? Are they really just statements of intent? Or are they based on something? And to get back to the point where we started, we need to be clear about what the emergency disaster management policy in this context might include. So I wanted to start off by, you can see here, you can get aims, objectives, and then later on in the National Disaster Management Policy of Zambia, you'll then have listings of the key institutions and the key stakeholders. So all the kind of things that Sawa, Wahid, Mohammed Al-Tamimi, and of course Lubna were talking about, actually about the relationship between capacity, the relationship between institutions, the relations between aims and objectives are included in this policy document. But what we've got to decide is this policy a plan? And that's the question I'd probably leave with you. Does the Zambian National Disaster Management Policy actually represent a plan to deal with emergencies in practice? Or is it just a framework in itself? So what we're trying to think about here is how does these things all fit together organisationally? And what would they include as being good practice, and what would they include as bad practice? So I just want you to spend a bit of time with you there while we were together talking about, well, if you think about what a good plan should have in it, then you can then look at both your own experiences in Oman, but also the experiences in other countries. And you may actually say, well, you know, to yourself, our Omani plan does this bit better, but we don't really do that aspect very well indeed. So here, the Zambian National Disaster Management Policy, which could be interpreted as including many aspects which formulate the plan or may actually represent parts of the plan. So within the building capacity section, which Richard is going through now, you'll also see there's a link between the cycles that Lubna was talking about. So you have the idea of mitigation, the idea of response, the idea of recovery. And one interesting factor here, for example, if you hold that page, I noticed when looking at that one on page 14, the plan actually talks about building capacity for response before it talks about building capacity for disaster prevention. So it's talking about, in a sense, that response comes before prevention, or some may say in this plan, in this policy, which seems to be counterintuitive to the way we might think about disaster cycles and the things that Lubna was talking about here. So I just wanted to just spend 5 minutes there. So what I would like you to do is, in your own time, have a look at that Zambian disaster management policy. How does it measure up against how you do things in Oman? And how does it measure up against the kind of things we've just talked about what a good policy stroke plan should include, and indeed the relationship between the two? I'd like to move on now to the Indian one. Richard, would you be able to put the Indian one up for me, if that's possible?
Yeah, Dr. Lee, can I have a question, please?
Yeah, by all means, please chip in.
Sorry, Professor Lee. In your mind, what do you think, which country they have the best national, the disaster national plan, and which country they have the weak national plan? Because I can see most of them, they putting the national plan based on the Sandy framework for the disaster risk reduction to meet the international standard. They please them to have their own policy or document to show the world, oh, we do have this. But is it strong enough for their response? That's number one. Number two, the Muscat national plan. We cannot compare the other country's national plan with our country national plan because we don't have an access to our own national plan, disaster national plan. This is 2 questions. I'm sorry.
Okay. No, that's great. No, this is what these seminars are about, and I'll do my best to I'll give you an insight. I mean, it's difficult for me to comment about how good the Omani national plan is to Omanis who are dealing with the emergency plan, because you probably know better than I do. So on one level, I'll sort of sidestep that question. But what I would say is that, well, success and failure and good and bad are subjective terms, of course. I mean, and we started out with this idea. I purposely use the word, what is a good emergency plan? But actually, the good emergency plan is, can it meet the objectives or meet the targets and requirements of that particular country or that particular sector? And the sectors differ and the nations differ. So what you have had happening is 2 things. There's been a pressure at the top to create templates, if you like, a template of what a good emergency plan might include. So what these might be what we would call international standardization plans. So we can compare them, but we can't necessarily. So but the danger with this is that it's just simply a bureaucratic exercise. It allows national disaster management international elites to compare plans by national disaster national elites, if you like, if we put it that way. But so my argument would be very simple. that really you need to have a system, going back to what Alexander was talking about, which fits firstly the nature of the hazards, but also is accessible and effective for the culture and context of the nation in which it operates. The danger that we have, and we talk about this constantly, is that you'll often find that Western style disaster management plans, and you could say the international ones that I mentioned here are often Western based, are then tried to be translated, say, into non-Western societies, where really they need to be styled by those countries to make them fit their own resources. And you find that constantly in Africa. So to answer your question, Wahid, we just went through a Zambian disaster management policy, which may look great on paper, but I wonder, and I really do wonder, from our experiences working in Africa, how much of that planet actually exists in reality and how much of it exists on the ground. So here your idea of training and simulation becomes very important indeed. If Richard's still with us, Richard, do you want to chip in there? What's your observations from your experience in the field?
Can I adjust a point?
Yeah, by all means.
Yeah, with regard to the Oman National Plan, well, I had a look at it, and I think it met all or most of the principles mentioned by David Alexander, meaning it identifies the hazards, it has a clear command and control structure, it also have clear tasks, let's say, or stakeholders' duties. It's also mentions something about before the disaster, during and after the disaster. But as Lubna said, also it is like a short plan. It has a common language, meaning that to give each cluster its duties. I'm not worried about the plan itself. I'm just worried about the implementation of the plan. Thank you.
Yeah, and you make a very, very important point in the essay, actually, because remember the essay is split up into formulation, writing, and implementation of plans. And actually, I think if you go back to your point, Wahid's, we spend a lot of time looking at how to write and formulate one, and very little time looking about whether it's implementable, or whether you can implement it in practice. So one has, because of what we're talking about, these international plans. So if we look at the Indian example on the left-hand side here, the obvious point that needs to be mentioned is you've got a national disaster management plan, which is 192 pages long. So that's, one would say, a very big document. Mind you, India is a very big country, some would say, and it has a very complex system of government. So perhaps that's why the document is so long. But for some countries, the idea of having a document that was 192 pages long would not be seen as being an example of good emergency practice. In others, it's accessible for what they need. So to get back to Richard's point about, how many versions you've got, which versions and what copy it should be, then an obvious point to be mentioned here is this plan is May 2016, and it's also 192 pages long. And if you were to take the point made about the changes that have taken place between versions, then actually the danger with many plans of that size is that the changes become very hard to track because the documents are so large. Richard, are you around? I want to give you a chance to just reflect on what Wahid was asking from your own experiences.
Well, Wahid's question I thought was excellent. It is absolutely essential to understand that some countries have produced excellent plans, but not for the benefit of their country, but more for the benefit of the UN ISDR framework, initially Hyogo, now Sendai, that they've signed up to. So a lot of work has gone into that. And that's for two reasons. And it tends to be largely risk reduction focused. So when you look on the UN ISDR website, you will find many national, what they will call them, national disaster management plans. When you actually open them and read them, they are national risk reduction plans. And the Zambian one we've just been looking at, and indeed the Indian one, which I've got open at the moment. Again, the focus is very much about risk reduction. Why? Because that's where the money has gone. The UN and the international community have poured money into countries that are prepared to do something about risk reduction. So if you're a developing country, you are going to go where the money is. The other reason why risk reduction has been more of a focus for national planning is politics. Every time there's a change of government from one party to another party, the National Disaster Management Risk Reduction Plan changes, because it's another way of saying the previous government were absolute rubbish. They didn't look after the country. We're the new government. We're going to change things. We're going to make things much, much better. We're actually going to achieve real risk reduction. So it becomes used as a kind of a political weapon against one another amongst the parties. Another reason why response has often been neglected as part of national disaster management plans is because the focus of risk reduction has gone to the ISDR, the International Strategy for Disaster Reduction. Response sort of moved to OCHA, which is the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. But as you'll remember from CPD4, OCHA's role is to coordinate external assistance. Their job is to bring together the nations of the world to respond to a stricken country. They are not there to ensure that the nation itself, the stricken country, has a national response plan. And neither is ISDR. Both of these two big organizations, ISDR and OCHA, both have allowed national planning for response to fall in between them. And that's been a point that we've been making for a while. Another issue with national disaster response plans is where the resources that are going to be used in that plan are maintained as unclear. And that's because governments don't want to be too clear about what funding commitments they would have to make in order for that ministry or that agency to achieve its requirement. The plans that are produced assume that the ministry or the agency or the institution will use existing equipment in an emergency. And too often, national planning for disasters has become a kind of an excuse for a new spending spree. And I'll give you an example. In a staff college in a country, I won't mention which country, it wasn't in the Middle East, in a particular country in its staff college, I was asking what were the strengths of the military in disaster management. And an Air Force officer put his hand up and he said, we have night fighting equipment, which means that we can see in the dark. And that would be really helpful in natural disasters because we would be able to see in difficult circumstances and give reports from the sky to the responders down below. Next speaker after me was a representative from the National Disaster Management Agency. During this man's talk, the Air Force officer put his hand up again and made a request. And he said, will the Disaster Management Agency please buy the Air Force some night fighting goggles because they don't have the night fighting goggles. So having been told that the military have this capability, we actually discovered although in principle they had the capability, they were expecting the National Disaster Management Agency to buy them the capability as part of a risk reduction strategy. And my last point is this. Very few plans that I have read cover not only risk reduction and response, but actually move on to recovery. And one of the most powerful lessons that came out of Haiti after the earthquake and the response there was a comment by a member of the World Bank who said this: every response activity is either developmental or counter-developmental. That means every way that we respond, the way that we respond either assists recovery and development into the future, or it in some way counters recovery and development in the future.
Thank you very much, sir, Richard. Is there any points that anybody would like to make on that? Okay. Well,
thank you for the information. Actually,
yeah, we're here. Yeah, come on, chip in.
No, I say thank you for the explanation and clarity.
Okay, splendid. Let's just move on to the Indian plan, because actually, I mean, okay, here's another analytical tool. Of course, we need to identify who's responsible for the plan. So, in a sense, on the front page, it's the Ministry of Home Affairs, and that in itself may create, may speak messages to the policymakers amongst you as to who's responsible for it. Can you go to the agenda? Sorry, the contents page, Richard, which just follows the Prime Minister's statement, and just to illustrate where we are with this, here we go. You will see, for example, here, this of course is a May 2016 plan, and really this illustrates some of the points that we've just been talking about here, that in this Indian plan, the vast majority from sections 1.7 all the way through to 2 was covering, you know, some 13 pages of the plan in its first section are about locating it within relations to the Sendai framework and in relations to the international norms that take place within that. So here's about a way of understanding how the plan is situated. It's a good thing, but it also is a good way of you illustrating examples, for example, of how this impact has been of Sendai and also of the disaster risk reduction. And you'll also see, for example, if you look at the chapter 3, for example, here about reducing risks, enhancing resilience, that you see you have not just the identification of different types of important hazards, but also a clear identification of DRR within each of those sections, so that actually quite a large majority of this plan from 31 all the way through to 64, some 30 pages, are about, in many ways, disaster risk reduction concepts. Now, from my experience in the past, let's put it this way, one would have not seen that kind of level in a plan of this size to actually have that amount addressed to disaster risk reduction, and that actually reflects a changing agenda. It may be changing priorities, but it also has major implications for resources, because there your coordination becomes very, very, very important. You'll also see, for example, as Lubna talked about, the difference of different sections on preparedness and response and on notions of governance. But here, if you look at page on chapter 6 on recovery and building back better, again the usage of international terminology and frameworks. But you'll also see here, for example, when we talk about recovery, that section actually is largely about trying to identify who does what in terms of recovery, and illustrates when you look at this document, if you want to have a look at the difference or the tensions that can be between the frameworks that are created for response and the frameworks that are created for recovery. Because as we've talked about in courses, often how you recover is shaped by your response. And that is not always reflected in plans. Plans often treat them as two separate parts of the cycle with complete changes of relationships within them. Here's an illustration that some documents can be quite small, but I guess from a critical analytical perspective, what you'll be looking at is, is there a clear relationship between the response aspect and the recovery aspect? Do they make sense? Are they treated as completely separate, or are they treated as holistic and compatible?
It is interesting.
So here's a good example. Sorry.
It's interesting to see here. I mean, if you look at the number of pages for risk reduction from 0 to about 99,
Right.
0 to 95, it's risk reduction, and then 5 pages of response. 95 to 100 is response.
Exactly. And traditionally, we would say, or certainly my experience, and I hope Richard's going to agree with me here, when we looked at plans in the past, it would have been an inverted opposite. You'd have seen probably 5 pages on risk reduction and a lot on response. And actually, when we're training and simulating, we focus very much on response. And here you have a national plan which has, you know, a complete difference of change, a focus within it. Now, whether it wants to do that is for you to decide. And that's one of the critical evaluation points that you need to make. Does this plan actually, is it accessible? Is it clear to the stakeholders that they know what they're doing? And you'll also see at the back of this document, you can look at it in your own time because we're short of time, that you will also see the use of tables with the identification of actors and responsibilities. And the tables and the pages gone for reams and reams of them. you know, and I wonder, is that a good thing? Is it comprehensive, or is it actually confusing in relation to that? So what I wanted you to look at the Indian plan, simply because it illustrates really where we are with some of the state of the art. Some of it's good, some of it's bad, but what it does illustrate is choice about what this plan should be about and what it should try to do. And what you will also see is listings of key institutions. But I wonder also whether it does deal with, for example, command centers, whether it does deal with communication strategies in the way that we've talked about before. And I'll let you have a look at that in your own time. So you might want to use that Indian plan. It's a very good example where you can draw out examples for instances and examples for your essay, for example, of a very comprehensive, big style, almost big picture disaster management plan. The Zambian one was a good example of understanding the role of a policy. And you might want to also think about how your country fits into their choices about what they want. So I just wanted to end the session, because I know we've been going for just over an hour now, to illustrate in this seminar how you can use these documents. Just draw out one or two examples when you're talking about in relation to formulation, writing, and implementation, and use these documents to illustrate that. So you'll see, for example, on point 8.7, you have a big section on implementation, but it's again implementation of DRRR, of the Disaster Risk Reduction Strategy. And here you have very clear ideas about implementation in that particular domain. So to illustrate the point that Richard made very strongly, that many disaster management plans, emergency plans, have now become disaster risk reduction plans, is this the case with the Indian one you have in front? Question mark. Have a think about that. It's worth you thinking about for your essays. So I want to end now, because we're short of time, with just opening out. Are there any questions that you'd like to ask, or any points you'd like to make from this last part of the session together, either to myself, to Richard, or to both of us?
Just while you are thinking, if there are any questions, I just wanted to make a couple of points which I think are worthwhile. We've talked in terms of response about a number of things which keep coming up time and time again. And if you think about each of the exercises we did in CPD 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5, one of the first questions that gets asked by the public, members of the public, after a natural disaster is, where is everybody? Where is my family? Where are my children? Where's my husband, my wife? Where's everybody gone? The whole business about casualty tracking, I don't see any mention of that in this plan. Also, identifying the dead is an issue that comes up time and time again. I don't see any mention of that here. And one of you mentioned earlier on, I think it might have been Salwa or Lubna. What about dealing with? No, it wasn't. It was Mohammed Al-Baluchi. What about dealing with external agencies, dealing with international agencies? How do we ask for it? How do we accept it? Who's in charge of doing that? So casualty tracking, victim identification, external assistance, evacuation operations. There are basic aspects of every response that need to be included in the response section. No mention of them made here in this India plan whatsoever. So these are some things which are worth looking at. You know the things you should be looking for, because these are the things you've been doing in the exercises over the past couple of years. And my last point about plans is a plan should show how often it should be exercised and when it is next being revised. And if you look at 10.3, 10.4, testing the plan, learning to improve, revising and updating. That's good. They're beginning to show that they understand that there's a necessity to maintain and update the plan. So often that bit.
But it's only 2 pages.
Yeah.
192.
Exactly.
Okay, well, with that in mind, then I think we should call this to a session. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope you found that useful, and it's building up more of these ideas about what kind of things you might include within your essays and doing it in a kind of dynamic way. So, unless anybody has any final points, I'd like to thank everybody for being dynamic and contributing to the session, and to call this session to a close. So you are very free to leave the session now. Thank you very much for your time.